Okay, I think we're ready to go now. I want to welcome all of you to our ninth Campfire. We'll be talking this morning about responsive design, especially with focus on the mobile era. And this is a special Campfire for us because I won't be presenting it. So you guys will get to hear someone new from Mertech Data. We have Aaron Gulak here. He's one of our web developers, and he'll be presenting to us on this topic. So, Aaron, why don't you go ahead?
Yeah, thanks, Oliver. As Oliver said, we'll be talking about responsive web design today. And for those of you who don't know, responsive web design is a design technique to create one website that consistently looks, feels, and functions great, regardless of the screen size you're using, whatever internet speeds you might have, or even devices you might be on. But before I get into too much detail about this, I'd like to do a quick overview on kind of how web design has evolved over the years. So to start off, we're going to talk a little bit about fixed layout. Now what this has been around for probably the longest out of the ones we're going to talk about. And this is kind of web designers would approach a website kind of like a magazine where each page was a static page with a fixed pixel width and didn't really change much regardless of anything. And this was really great for developers at the time, gave them a lot of control. It was easy to implement, and there was a lot of consistency with it. But from a user perspective, you might imagine there'd be some issues with this. And to kind of put that into picture, we'll take a look at an example of a fixed website here. So we have a government website here, pretty standard website, and you can see it looks fine. There's a little bit of white space here on the side, but it acts about how you would expect. But the issues start to come once you get into these different devices. You have a tablet here, and it still looks okay, still operates fine, but you gotta do a little bit of horizontal scrolling here to find your way around. The big problem, of course, comes when you switch all the way down to smartphone. And you can see here it becomes quite a task to navigate through this page. A lot of the links and stuff are pretty small now. They may be hard to click on, especially with your finger, like a lot of smartphones are set up these days. So you can imagine there was some issues with this. So kind of the answer to the fixed layout was this idea of a fluid layout. And as you would expect, percentages were used where elements were now set to kind of a relative size depending on the browser screen. And so as the page would shrink or grow, the elements would kind of respond accordingly. And this was actually a great solution for a long time, dealt with a lot of different screen sizes, and designers were pretty happy with it. But of course, we know now with the blow up of the mobile era, we're dealing with probably over 200 screen sizes. And so this solution kind of, we started to see a little bit of holes in it. And to get a better idea of some of those holes, we'll take a look at another example here. We have just this normal blog website here, and it expects about acts how you would expect here. We have the entries and everything looks fine. And then as you shrink down to tablet, you'll notice the blog post kind of shrink accordingly, still looks great, still very readable. So that's kind of the idea of fluid. But the problem comes again when we go down to a smartphone here. You'll see everything has shrunk so small that now it's a little bit hard to read. The words are squished together and just not really what you would want from a mobile website. So with these issues, kind of a whole new design philosophy was needed. One layout was no longer good enough to solve these problems. So with that came this idea of responsive web design. And as I said before, the aim was to make one website that looked and worked great no matter what device you were on. So we see here desktop, tablets, and smartphones, and those are the main three we're going to be talking about. But it really became more than just looks. We were talking about speed, functionality. There's a lot of different ideas involved with responsive design. So as you might imagine, loading a full-scale website onto a mobile device can be pretty taxing and can take a long time. And as most of us know, when a website takes a long time to load, it can really affect whether you're going to go back to it. So the really cool thing about responsive web design is that it incorporates all kinds of techniques. It's sort of a hybrid design theory. And so fixed layout is actually used in it a little bit. Fluid layout's used in it. whatever's needed really is used to make this website responsive. And we're going to talk about some of those techniques that are used here in a minute, but again, I want to show you another example here. So we have this Boston Globe website here, and it's a typical news site as you would expect. Looks pretty nice. It's all clean, organized. The images look great. You have your normal drop downs like you would expect. All great. But you'll kind of see how the website starts to change a little bit when we go to tablet. So you shrink down to tablet here. Some of the elements have kind of readjusted accordingly. You have images going underneath each other, and you'll notice one of the main things about responsive web pages is the menu bar. The menu bar has now shrunk to where there's only some of the essential information, and it no longer drops down. You have to click on it now, and that's to account for tablets and smartphones where you don't really have the mouse over effect. And then if we switch down to mobile here, you can see it almost becomes a completely different website. Your search bar is now clickable, your menu bar is even smaller, and everything is kind of in a one-column layout here. The images are a little bit smaller. So that's really the idea behind a responsive website, and we're going to be talking about some of those techniques. And the first technique we're going to be talking about is this idea of flexible grids. Now, before I get into this, just so you guys know, I'm not talking about grids that you may be used to. There's no data being loaded into these grids. What I'm speaking about more is the layout of the page, and that's what these grids are all about. And they're really the backbone of any good responsive website that you're going to see. So kind of the way it works is, for the sake of argument, we'll say we have 12 columns for your grid layout. So on desktop, you have a 12-column layout. Each element then is allotted a certain amount of columns, and so as the page shrinks, the number of columns on the page is going to decrease, and the elements on the page are forced to kind of readjust accordingly so that they can still fit onto the page. So you see kind of a column snapping effect here where elements will pop down underneath each other or things like that. And it's really a cool technique, and it's actually pretty easy to use once you get it built. So like I said, this is one of the key points of responsive design, and we'll see it in action here on this same website. Just a little demo here. We see we have 3 triangles, and let's say again, for the sake of argument, we're dealing with a 12-column layout. We'll say each of these triangles has 4 columns. So as you would expect, we have 3 triangles per row here, and everything looks great, everything's organized. And then we'll switch to tablet, and now let's say it shrinks down to 8 columns. Well, now you have two triangles per row, and the other ones have kind of snapped underneath each other accordingly. And then of course we go down to smartphone, and it's now a 1 triangle per row type of thing. And that really is what you would want from mobile devices, because that's kind of the workflow you have when you're on a mobile device. So these ideas of grids you'll see all over the place in responsive design. And kind of the underlying things of the responsive grids are these idea of media queries. And what it is simply is it's just conditional blocks of CSS, and they're only used when certain criteria is met. So when we're talking about responsive design, the main criteria we're usually talking about is widths of the browser. So you're checking what the maximum width is on a browser, and you can kind of guess what device you're using based on that. So when you reach a certain width, you can apply certain CSS accordingly. And to get an idea of that, I wrote a couple of these media queries. This is just in a CSS file, pretty simple stuff, but you see I have the 2 media queries here. One of them is checking for a maximum width of 300 pixels, and that's usually when you're dealing with smartphones. And then the other one is 960 pixels, and that's usually going to be your tablets. So you can see you can set all kinds of things inside of these. Any valid CSS really. You can change the font size, make it a little bit smaller on a smartphone. You can set up classes to where you hide things when you're on a smartphone. It's used a lot for maybe menu bars or images that don't really look great on a smartphone. You can show things only on a tablet, really anything you want. But I want to take a minute and focus on this last thing I did here, this class column 4. And this is really where the media queries kind of work along with the flexible grids. So as I said before, those triangles were allotted 4 columns. So the way you would do it is you would attach this class to it, column 4. And depending on the device being used, those 4 columns would take up a certain amount of space. So you see on a smartphone, it would take up the whole page, so there would only be 1 per page. When you're dealing with a tablet, half the page, things like that. So that's kind of how they work hand in hand, and you can really, like I said, implement anything you want into these media queries. And the main thing you want to think about when dealing with the media queries is your breakpoints. We see here we have 3 different breakpoints. We have smartphones, tablets, and desktops. And those are the main 3 that you're usually going to deal with, what usually come when you're dealing with frameworks and things. But it's really, the cool thing is it's really all up to the designer. If they want to account for every possible situation, you can do that. Or if you want to only deal with tablets and desktops, if you're having a specific web application or something, then you can do that accordingly. So it's really another cool facet of responsive design. And going along with that, we have the idea of responsive images. And this is probably the trickiest part of responsive design. And the reason that is because you're not just dealing with making an image look good on a page. With images, you also have to make sure it doesn't affect the speed of your website. So, as you might imagine, loading a full-scale, high-resolution image onto a smartphone could take a long time and is really going to make your website slow down, especially if you have a lot of images. And then the other part is resizing an image too big can affect the way it looks. Making a big image too small, you lose a lot of the detail. So when we're talking about simply just the look of the image, fluid design is where you can get away with a lot of things here, and that's kind of what makes responsive more of a hybrid design technique. So you can just set an image to a certain percentage, set a max width on it, so you know it'll shrink and grow as you want it to. But the problem can be, like I said, loading a high-resolution image onto a mobile device. And so they're still working out a lot of solutions for this, but they do have a couple things, and I have here a couple examples of some plugins you can use that kind of address this issue. And I won't go into detail about most of them. You can look them up if you want yourself. But the one I will focus on is this Cincha.io, and this is the last one listed there. And this is a really cool new technique out, just a little plugin. And what it is it's a cloud-based storage, and you load all your images onto this cloud, and then when you're calling your image, you call it from the cloud. And so what that does is it automatically checks what device the image is being called from, and it will resize it as you would want it to. So it's a really cool way of doing things, and it's really what I think is going to be the future of responsive images, because it's just easy, it just makes sense, and there's not too much hassle involved in it. But there are different techniques out there, and it just depends on what you're looking for. So you may be wondering how to get started with this kind of stuff. Well, there's a lot of different approaches to take. One of them that's becoming really popular is this idea of a mobile-first approach. And as you might expect, normally what you would do is you would get your website and you would get it to look good on your desktop where you're programming, and you would, and then once you make it look good, you would make it responsive so that when you shrink down, it still looks the way it should. Well, that technique works, and there's nothing really wrong with it, but a new approach that's coming out is this mobile-first approach. And what it is you actually start with the mobile look first. You make your website look good on a mobile, you hide the things that you don't want, and what this does is it really forces the designer to get rid of a lot of the clutter that you see on a lot of websites, and they can really figure out what's important for their web page. And then as the screen grows and you're allotted more space, you can kind of add the less important things as you go. So that's just one technique. There's a lot of ways of approaching it. But with all these things involved in responsive design, it might be a little overwhelming on how you're really going to implement this yourself. And the cool thing about responsive design is if you're feeling bold, you can go and you can create this all from scratch. You can create your own media queries, create your own grid system, do everything you want on your own. But there are many frameworks out there that really make your life a lot easier. And there's 2 here, Bootstrap and Foundation. And these are 2 of the more popular ones here. Bootstrap is actually made by Twitter. And what it is you just download it and include it like you would a normal CSS file. and it comes with so much stuff just right out of the box. You have a mobile first approach, you have responsive images, you have some typography that looks good on mobile devices. It comes with its own grid system, and really everything you would need all comes in here with styles included, and it's a really cool framework to use. The other one we have here is Foundation, and this is pretty similar. Comes with all the grid system and everything included in it, and it's kind of the main competitor to Bootstrap right now. The main difference I would say between the two would be that Foundation is kind of designed for to give the styling to the designers, where it just comes with the responsiveness of it, and the styling is left more up to the designer. Whereas Bootstrap comes with its own style. It's very unique styling system. So probably personally, I would say I like Bootstrap a little bit better. It has a little bit more functionality, a little bit easier to use. A lot of the class names you would use and things just make a lot of sense. Another really cool thing to use when you're working with responsive design is this website here, and it's mediaquery.es. And this isn't a framework or anything, but it's a really good point of reference when you're talking about this mobile first approach that I had mentioned. And what it does, it just shows different examples of all these websites here. You have some college websites. The websites aren't really too important, but the idea is you see how they were designed from a mobile first approach. And you can click on the link, it'll take you to the actual website, but you can kind of see how they started small and then expanded from there. And it can kind of really help you get an idea of the mentality and the approach to responsive design. So I encourage you, if you have any interest in this, to check out this website. And you can really Google responsive web design and entertain yourself for hours on all the different information that's involved. So with that in mind, now that we kind of have an idea of responsive design, let's take another look at an example of a website. And it works out really well, actually, because here at Mertech, we just redid our website to be completely responsive. So if you haven't seen it yet, I encourage you to check it out. But this is the website here, mertechdata.com. And for those of you who have been to our website before, you might be thinking, this looks quite different. And that's kind of the point, is it's totally responsive now, so it looks good wherever you're at. And you can kind of see here on desktop, it's very clean, very organized. You have everything clearly laid out. And now that you understand this grid system a little bit, you might notice that it's kind of set up in a bit of a grid system. You can see these 4 columns here showing up a lot. You have still your mouse over menu bar, as you would expect. We have our products here in this cool slider, very high quality images. It all looks great. And then we switch down to tablet here, and you can see the website still looks similar, still have the slider, but it's shrunken a little bit. And we've moved to more of a 2-column system here, where all of our products here are listed like that. You still have all the contact information you would want. Everything's still there. It's just much more tablet friendly. And one of the big differences you notice with responsive design, as I said, is the menu bar. So you see, instead of having menu bar you would normally have, you have this clickable thing here where it expands. You have your search bar in here, and everything is now clickable, still easy to navigate, but works great on a tablet. And then the biggest change you're going to see here is when we switch down to mobile devices. So you can see, again, almost becomes a different website, but all the information is still there. So the slider now is gone, as it, it's hard to get that on a smartphone. You can see the announcements are still there. Products are still very nicely displayed. The images on them look good. You can see we have our news items here, contact information. Everything is still there. It's just a much more mobile-friendly layout. Menu bar, everything you would expect. So this is really the crux of a responsive website, as I said, is just get it to look good everywhere you go. So with that in mind, we actually have our main web designer who was involved in this website with us today. His name is Jeff Evans, and he's going to be joining us. We're going to be able to answer some of the questions you may have about responsive design. I know I covered a lot of topics here, but I think between me and Jeff, we could answer some of your guys' questions, and I have some questions for him too, prepared, if it comes to that. But we can ask some of those questions now if anyone has any.
Well, Aaron, I'll get it started here. So,
Okay.
uh, we've got quite a few developers here that have done Visual Data Flex work, and I think all of them may be looking at this and wondering how might this integrate with web application framework? Is it already responsive, or what do you need to do with it? Can you kind of give us a little lesson on that?
Yeah, definitely, definitely. I know Visual Data Flex is widely used in this circle. Well, the idea with Visual Data Flex is they take a very interesting approach. You know, as everyone who uses it know, they've been involved in Windows applications for a very long time. And so for their users, since they started moving into this web app framework, they wanted to maintain that consistent look and feel. So really, the way they approach the web app framework is to give it a look very similar to a Windows application. And so we know with responsive design is the whole idea is to kind of change your website to fit into whatever device you're using. So it's a little conflicting from that aspect, not in a bad way, it's just a different approach. And so what they do is their goal is to maintain that Windows application look. So they kind of have more of a fixed layout, but of course you can go in and customize that to your heart's content depending on your knowledge of CSS and everything. But yeah, out of the box, it comes with a more of a fixed layout.
Okay, we also got a question or actually kind of a remark from Sean about in relation to flexible grids, and he was wondering about differentiating them from tables. Are the flexible grids are they HTML tables, or is it something different?
No, actually, this was a thing for me to get kind of wrap my head around at first because anytime you hear grids, you think of that table type of thing. What it more is it's all based on the CSS and it uses those media queries. And so what it does is it kind of splits your website um, up into these different columns, and so you're more adding CSS classes to all your elements and giving them a certain amount of columns on the page, and so those columns are allotted a certain amount of space depending on what you have set up in your CSS, but all it is just attaching these classes to the elements on your page.
Okay, and we have a question from Chuck. I'm going to try unmuting you, Chuck. Okay, you should be
I
able
just
to go
wanted to
now.
know what you guys used to build the Mertech site. Looks really good.
Maybe Jeff can
Hey,
answer that for us.
yeah, Jeff, definitely.
Yeah, we started out with kind of a template from it's called themeforest.net, and it kind of had the responsiveness built into it. So you take those responsive elements and then you customize it to look and feel how you like. Um, a, a main focus was to keep it very, image intensive, and still have the information displayed, very easy to read. Um, so that's a great place to start is themeforest.net. It's also a WordPress site, so it actually makes it very easy for the user to update text and images kind of on the fly. So yeah, that's where we started.
Okay, and then we have another question here. Let me try and unmute Andrew. Uh, Andrew, go ahead. Okay, well, don't have Andrew there. It doesn't sound like VoiceWise. Andrew's question was, um, do you have any suggestions on how to present real grids of data in a responsive way? So, in other words, if we're dealing with an actual grid format, how do you make that responsive?
Yeah, that's actually a pretty big challenge with with responsive design is getting that to work, because as you can imagine, on a mobile device, showing a grid full of data can be a little bit challenging. So there's a lot of techniques that are out there, and a lot of different frameworks approach it differently. But it really comes down to whether you want to maintain your grid look, or if you're willing to kind of change things around a little bit. I've seen a couple techniques where instead of having your horizontal rows, once you get into a mobile look, you kind of switch to more of a vertical rows, if that makes sense. And so it really changes the look of a grid, and it's a pretty drastic change. But that's one approach that people take. Some other people, they will hide some columns and kind of figure out, okay, well, on a mobile device, I'm only going to show these 3 columns, and that can help a little bit. So that's still something that people are trying to figure out how to make work, but there are a couple different techniques out there.
Okay, and we also have a suggestion in that regard from Sean. Sean, I'm going to unmute you, and maybe you can mention something about it there.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yep.
Cool. So when I've moved from tables to something that's more responsive, the biggest thing is to move from the table to divs. So if you can make something using div elements that looks like your table, and then you can start applying responsive elements to those div items. And what I would do, for example, like you say, some columns you would hide, but other columns you might move underneath. So rather than having columns next to each other, you would have, or cells next to each other horizontally, you'd have cells underneath each other, and then maybe an obvious break cell, or formatting on a cell to make an obvious break. And you can do that with your standard responsive grid, but the first key is to move from tables to a div structure, to use divs instead of a table, TDs and what have you. It can make it more complicated, and it is difficult if you're used to using tables, but it's worth it, I think.
Yeah, I've seen that method a little bit myself too. And another one too, mentioning that, they're also, what I've seen a lot of people do is do expandable rows. And so you have just some basic information, and then if you click on the row, it kind of expands down and shows more of the columns that you would have before. So that can be really tricky to implement, but that is one other technique that I've seen too.
We had another question from Ray that I'll address here. Let me read his question. It says, if I have a blank slate for development toolset and considering the responsive design approach, is there a set of tools that work better than another? I can get anything. So that's a pretty open-ended question. It kind of depends on where you're hoping to go with things. Certainly, we've taken various approaches. For instance, there's a couple of frameworks that are very mobile-centric. Sencha, the one that Aaron mentioned in response or in relation to responsive images. Sencha also does a whole bunch of other stuff, and one of the things that they do that's interesting is they actually have 2 different toolkits available that are not really compatible with each other. One of them is for building mobile websites, and one of them is for building desktop websites. And so their approach is that you actually develop 2 separate websites. And it's a very popular tool set. It's commercially licensed. It's used all over. It's a very good tool set. On the other hand, there are other frameworks available. Another real popular one that you'll find is Angular, AngularJS. There's also a framework called Kendo that's made by Telerik, and those have more of the full desktop down to mobile sort of responsive design for them, where you can go all the way up to a desktop website with certain controls, and then basically they scale down. So there's lots of different approaches that way. There are some other tools that can help along the way. Maybe Jeff can mention some of the tools that he's used, in relation to building responsive design, maybe even in relation to prototyping it?
Yeah, a great way to start is with using Twitter Bootstrap, and to actually start your prototyping in code. And so it comes all back to that mobile first technique. So you're actually creating elements, from a very minimalistic state. So as far as, navigation, main content, and footer. And so if you start with those elements, it already takes out a lot of the elements that you used to start with in creating like a desktop version first. So if you actually just start with code with Twitter Bootstrap, it gives you the elements set up in different classes. So you start to really know what those classes mean, and you can implement a layout of a page very fast. So if you start with that and work your way out to desktop, it kind of simplifies the process perspective.
Yeah, and that mobile first approach works along with Bootstrap, and it kind of, like I had said before, forces you to think a little differently. And so you may, instead of having checkboxes on your website, may go with a different technique that's more mobile friendly, maybe a sticky button or something. So that's really, as Jeff said, a great place to get started with Bootstrap, because they have a lot of those things built in, and you can just get your website going with that stuff off the get-go, and you don't have to come back to it later.
As for Ray also mentioned, possible backends for this, like NetBeans, things like that. So on the back end, there's lots of different pieces that you can look at as well. You can look at things like PHP frameworks like Cake and Zend. There's Ruby on Rails, which is a really nice framework, and of course you can build a JSON-based interface with web app as well. So there are quite a few options that way. When you look at some of these other back-end toolkits like Cake or Zend, you're going to find that a lot of the actual abilities are the same across most of them. So they may have a slightly different way of doing it. They may have support for multiple object relational models, things like that. But in general, you're going to find these MVC-based frameworks or MVVM possibly based frameworks out there that use an active record model. That's become pretty standard. And the nice thing about a lot of these frameworks is that they support a broad variety of relational structures. So, excuse me, really it's kind of beneficial to look at your specific case and pick the tool for that case rather than something that I think would work across the board. The PHP ones certainly have a huge amount of support available for them, which is kind of nice. And so, Aaron, I had another question for you. What was that tool that you were using to kind of show us the websites in?
Oh yeah, well this here is a really cool website to use and great for web designers. What it is you just go to responsive.is and you can enter in any URL here and kind of emulate a different devices. So you see up here you have this menu bar. You can click on desktop. It'll show you desktop view. You can click on tablet landscape, tablet portrait, and shrink all the way down to smartphone. But it's really good because instead of having to go to different devices to test out your website, you can just do it all right here on this website, and you can get an idea of how your website's going to look on all different kinds of devices. And you can really do it with any website. So if you're just curious to some responsive websites, how they look, you can do it with any website you want.
And we got one other question here in relation to working with like Python in relation to building some of this. We actually haven't really done that much that way, so I actually don't have any feedback in that area. So some of the issues related to that are very specific to the platform also. So if you have a more specific question on that, I'd be happy to answer it, but we haven't done much that way. The one other question we got was in relation to high resolution displays. How do you deal with the fact that a lot of these tablets now have these super high res displays and things can look blurry on them? Is there anything out there for that?
Yeah, there actually is. That's obviously a new challenge with the Retina displays and everything. It's become kind of a new situation, but the problem with that mainly comes down to images, and that's really, you can go pretty extensively into that. It's a pretty complicated situation, but basically you have so many pixels per inch, and images that normally look good on devices go onto a Retina display or a high resolution display, and they can become very pixelated, hard. You lose a lot of the quality essentially, and so some of those other plugins that I showed on that one page kind of address that issue. They use different things, a lot of maybe server-side things to handle the Retina readiness of devices. So there's definitely things out there for that. Nothing that I've used personally, but people are starting to be forced to kind of address this situation.
Okay, and we got a question from Ross. Ross, I'm going to try and unmute you. Okay, you should be able to speak now. Oh, maybe no microphone for Ross. Okay, let me ask his question here. Ross asks, has anyone used Adobe's Dreamweaver multi-view design tool? Have you ever used that, Jeff?
I have not used that design tool. I know, Dreamweaver in the past is definitely much more user-friendly and in creating, different websites. But I've kind of tended to go more towards the, more of a manual approach to designing websites rather than using Dreamweaver, just because the freedom you have. Although that tool sure is good for testing, your markup.
Alrighty, well, I'd like to thank everyone for taking the time and also for participating. We always love when we get some questions in this regard. As usual, all this information is going to be available soon, whether it be on YouTube or the slides on our website will be available in the next couple days, and we'll also be sending all of you out information on the next Campfire. So we look forward to doing that. But yeah, I'd like to thank everyone for joining us, and yeah, we'll see you next time.